Now, we're going to look at the relationship between male and female shamans and their deities, the mother and father gods. And as we can see, as we look at this series of images, we can see that the masks or the postures or the other kind of attributions that were taken on by shamans in order to relate to their deities, and their understanding of who their gods were and who their deities were was very much related to what they were doing as shamans, how they worked magically as shamans. So we're going to look at the things that teach us much about male and female shamans as they slowly begin to develop a form of spirituality that will lead us to the mystery. Let's take a quick tour of shamans and goddesses and gods, earth goddesses, earth gods, and shamans from the period that we call the Aryan period and the Taurian period. Very often, gods and shamans are represented phallically. We have here a Pan. Notice that he is ithiphallic. His penis is erect. Here we have another representation of what will become known as the Green Man, who is also a symbol of male fertility. If we take a look at the goddess Athena, she is part of a grand archetype we know as the crone, or sometimes the warrior crone. Athena was the patroness and the goddess of Athens, and in her great temple, she was represented with all the symbols of her powers, her great spear, the helmet of invisibility, and many other things, the owl that represented the presence of Athena. Here is Athena with the owl. The crone is a very ancient kind of goddess, not an earth mother, not a fertility goddess, but a shamaness. Here are some representations of this kind of shamaness. You notice she's not fat with bulging hips and bulging breasts. She's rather a powerful woman. Now we can compare and look at what happened in the earliest matriarchal and patriarchal priesthoods. In the prehistoric period, where there were matriarchal priesthoods, such as the Cretan Minoan and what we call partnership societies, very often there was a priestess queen with a male consort. And then later, as the old matriarchies, which are settled, and trading or agricultural civilizations are slowly taken over by invading patriarchal cultures, a transition occurs. And this is the development of agricultural and animal husbandry. And it is still seen and understood in these periods that agriculture and the use of animals and animal husbandry are all gifts of the goddesses. In other words, it's women who have given this to humanity. And this is represented in the imagery that we have of goddesses and shamanesses. For example, the triple goddesses that we find in all cultures. This is a Native American triple goddess, which consists of the maiden, what we call the maiden, and the mother, and the wise elder, or the crone. This is a kind of matriarchal image we're going to find all over the world. Notice that the crone is on the bottom. She's the ancient wise woman, and the one with the large breasts is the mother, and the very young one is the virgin, the maiden. Here we have the same kind of attributes given to Isis. Isis on the far right is the goddess of birth and life and death, and she has the image of the moon on her forehead, but she is also represented by the cat god Bast, the cat goddess, and Bast is the holy city of Isis, Bubastis, which possessed the greatest temple in the ancient world. And she's enthroned as a cat-headed incarnation. Here we have a winged Isis. that appears later. This was the original Divine Mother, probably in Egypt, and Egyptian culture and religion was basically matriarchal. Here we have Isis with the divine child Horus Harpocrates. This is a representation of Demeter and Persephone from the Eleusinian Mysteries, the daughter, the Kore, the maiden, the virgin, and the Earth Mother. Here we have a triple goddess, Hecate. Hecate is a very ancient goddess who, in earlier matriarchal culture, represented the crone and the maiden and the Earth Mother. She was later associated with the underworld and underworld traditions and magic. This is known as the Lepi Black Madonna, both a virgin and a mother, and she incorporated several elements of the ancient triple goddess. You'll see the heads that seem to hang down underneath her. Now, in the period of where history begins to be written, the historical period, the period of patriarchy, where patriarchy introduces whole new ways of doing things, many evil things like warfare and slavery, and many things that became technology, writing and trade, and so on. And very often the shape of society with a priest king, with a queen. At this point, then, we see the priestess as an oracle, one who delivers messages from the divine world, and a seer, and a tamer of animals, and one who's a specialist in plants and a healer with plants. This is the Nile River goddess. The Egyptians, who call themselves the Kemi, the Blacklanders, the hook-shaped hands symbolize regeneration. These are images of Lilith or Lilith. They date from about 2,300 years before the Christian era. She's referred to as a demon by the writers of the Hebrew Old Testament, but probably she was one of the earliest of the feminine Hebrew goddesses. She was a powerful, magical mother. She was not only Hebrew, she was also a Muslim goddess and a Sumerian goddess. She is referred to among the Sumerians as the hand of Inanna, and gathered males into her temple for fertility rites, sexual rites. In the traditions that we know, through the Kabbalistic and the old traditions, she was the original wife of Adam, and she claimed equality because they were created together in the image of Elohim. And she was a goddess of childbirth, and later she became representation of demonic life and threat to childbirth. This is the Inanna of power, the goddess of battle. She holds up her staff, and her troops prevail, just as it was with Moses. This is another plaque of Hecate, the triple goddess. This is the serpent goddess of Crete, which represents the coiling, inspiring energy of the serpent or the snake. And women made pets of and domesticated snakes. In fact, the Greeks very often had as their main pet in the house a serpent, a snake that lived near the hearth, and it was associated with Zeus and so on, and with the ancient matriarchal religion. And that is why that the priests of Apollo are said to have participated with Apollo in his overcoming or defeat of the great python, the great serpent. But she represents here a benevolence and a sacred power of the life force. And here we have Anahit, the lady of beasts and the goddess of sacred dance. We'll find goddesses associated and shamans associated with power over beasts and the domestication of animals. So sacred beasts to her were the bull and the lion, which later were more sacred in the Hebrew Temple of Solomon. This is Astarte, Lady of the Beasts, along with Lilith. She's one of the principal original Hebrew Elohim, or the goddesses and goddesses of the ancient Hebrew understanding before the time of Yahwism and the Semites in Phoenicia and so on. She was a consort of Baal, and she's dancing with a couple of foals here. This is Ariadne. It was in Crete that really, for the last time in recorded history, that a spirit of total partnership and harmony between men and women existed, says Eisler, and this is probably quite true. And here we have a priestess of the Cretan Minoans handling a serpent, a snake, symbolic of rebirth, and very often the many-breasted images of the Ephesian Artemis and Diana and so on seem to relate to this early image that we have, and trances and ecstatic dances were celebrated as the birth of Ariadne's son and lover Dionysus later on in Greek religion. This is Artemis, the huntress, like Diana with the hound. She's an Amazonian moon goddess worshipped at Ephesus. The entire torso is covered with nurturing breasts. And this is Kubale, or Rhea, the Mother Earth, the head of the mysteries of Kubale. Her queenship as the Magna Mater, or the Great Mother of Rome, is symbolized by the throne and the lions, so are the animals that she tames. Here we have the Penates, which is a shrine that was the central motif in most Roman households, and we see the female deities dancing over the serpent. Very often serpents lived in the hearth. Now the priests themselves dealt specifically not with so much animal taming, but with animal killing, animal sacrifice. And through the blood of these animals, they propitiated the ancestors and the deities. So the shaman and the priest king very often was a person who clothed himself totally in totemistic animal skins. Here we have a man inside the entire pelt of a deer or an antelope wearing horns. Here we have a man inside of the skinned externals of a bear. This is the Minotaur, which is known as the bull god, and the mask of the Minotaur was worn very often by male priests for this kind of potency. Here we do have a priest king of a culture that was located along the banks of the Indus River about 3,000 years before the Christian era, and it became a very advanced, agriculturally advanced civilization, somewhat comparable to Egypt and Mesopotamia, and it's only been recently excavated, but this would be a priest king from this shamanistic tradition. Here we have Pashupati, the horned god. It's the most ancient representation. We have the lord of the animals, which comes from the same culture, about 3,000 years before the Christian era. It's a seated horned deity, peacefully surrounded by totem beasts, and represents the harmony of domestication among males. Now, we have to understand that the initiatic mysteries evolved in an entirely different way than the royal state religion evolved in the classical period. Now, the mysteries were basically matriarchal in their roots. That is why the goddesses of the Eleusinian mysteries, for example, are Demeter and Persephone and so on. And even in the religions that emphasize a male hero like Orpheus, the roots of the myth and the roots of the goddesses involved are matriarchal. Not only that, they are chthonic. They are underground. They deal with the afterlife in the world of the underworld. And this underworld is known as the divine underworld. In order to visit this divine underworld, you make a divine descent. When we study another module about the oracular mysteries of the Greeks, we'll understand much more about the divine underworld. We find this kind of thing represented in the Eleusinian and the Delphic and the Attic and the Syrian mysteries. But royal state religion was quite different. It was patriarchal. The states were run by male kings, and in state religion, because the patriarchy, as it swept into the Egypt and Middle East about the beginning of the Aryan period, brought with them sky gods, and therefore the deities were Uranic. They were associated with the stars in the sky and astrology. And so heaven, or the place where heroes would go, would be up into the sky, and they would make a divine ascent, not a divine descent. Examples of these state religions would be the Egyptian and the Hebrew and the Roman. Now, in state religion, training of certain kinds of priests that did certain things was very exacting and very detailed. The Egyptian mysteries were held in awe because of their antiquity, and these were the mysteries of Osiris, the Osirian mysteries, later on the Icean mysteries, and then finally in the Hermetic period, the Hermetic mysteries. For perhaps a period of over 2,500 years, these forms of mystery, beginning with the ancient Osirian, the later Icean, and finally developing the Hellenistic mysteries of Thoth Hermes, were considered to be among the most profound mysteries in the world. In Persia, we find that there was a reform of the priesthood that happened perhaps 600-700 years before the Christian era with a great prophet known as Zoroaster. And Zoroaster introduced the astrological mysteries, and his priests were known as the Magi, and they introduced astrology and divine ascent to the entire Hellenistic world, and it's there that we find the roots of Vedic astrology and even Western astrology that is done today, that's not based on the same kind of a zodiac as Vedic astrology. The Hebrew religion was changed very much by the reform of the prophets, the prophetic reform of the priesthood ultimately. The prophets were rooted in Yahwism, which was a patriarchal form of Semitic religion that very strongly mitigated against the older matriarchal forms for being corrupt and introducing corruptions. But in about the 6th or 5th century before the Christian era, by that time there had been a bringing together of the two. You see, the state religion in Israel originally was somewhat influenced by the matriarchal and the other surrounding kinds of religion, and the prophets were on the outside, always barking at the feet of the rulers. And so we have this conflict between monarchic religion and prophetic religion, which is a theme that runs throughout the prophets in the Old Testament. But by the time we get to Isaiah, we find that there is a reform, and that the priesthood has literally been taken over by families that were trained in the guilds of the prophets. And through that, we got the wonderful synthesis that produced the Jewish Kabbalistic mysticism, Merkaba mysticism, the wisdom schools, and the Messianic mysteries. And finally, in the development of Christianity, Christianity becomes a state religion in the 4th century through the instrumentality of Constantine, and it becomes the state religion of the Byzantine Empire. And what it does is it incorporates the many of the modalities that it mitigated against and preached against for a long time, that is, the modalities of the so-called pagan religions and the pagan mysteries, and incorporated their liturgies and their vestments and other modalities into the Mass and into priestly discipline. And that is really what happened as the mysteries eventually died and the Christian era began. They were transformed and taken into Christianity, but in a greatly reduced faction, greatly reduced form. In fact, I wouldn't even call it reductionistic. I would just say it was kind of an unconscious influence that just permeated the whole business of Christian liturgy and understanding. Here we see the Pope. And if we look at his vestments and his garments, as we'll learn later, they are derived almost completely from the vestments of the transvestite Gallus, the priests of the goddess Cybele, who were very popular in the Roman Empire. So even priestly vestments go back to other forms of the mysteries. So we've gone now from Arian to Piscean humanity, from sort of the ancient clusters on a vine kind of people to individual immortal souls, as we start to find in the medieval world religion. We've moved from a sort of simple or pre-fallen state to a divided state, a psychologically dualistic, a fallen state. This is a time in the transition between Arian and Piscean, a transition of a few centuries before the coming of Christianity into Christianity, where we get ideas like the fall of man and the fall of the angels, and in fact the whole existence of angels, and all this just comes in at that point. And the idea that man has fallen and this emphasis upon genetic sin and all this sort of thing, this is introduced at that time, and mankind becomes subtly divided. We go from the ancient Apollonian period in Greece to the Dionysian period. The Apollonian is a period of very cerebral, ethical, and moral kinds of religion, to the Dionysian form, which is a kind of religion we call enthusiastic, that is interested in being taken over and possessed by a divine spirit. And this becomes later in Christianity a positive thing to being taken over by the Holy Spirit, and a negative thing in being taken over by a passion or lust. And eventually we go into the medieval veneration of chaste femininity in institutions like courtly love and the Marian forms of. And finally we arrive to our current state where men are from Mars and women are from Venus, and male equals masculine and female equals feminine, and we have a total separation or polarization of the sexes. So now let's look at a very interesting phenomenon that was first actually discovered and noticed by the Hellenistic scholar E.R. Goodenough. This is the interesting transformation in iconography that goes from the ancient god of all, Pan, in the ancient world, to the modern iconography, that is the representation in image of the Christian devil. And this is a kind of a paradigm of spiritual psychology in transition from the Arian to the Piscean kind of spirituality. There's an awful lot that could be said and written about this, but let's look at how it goes. Now, Pan, which means all, it's the ancient god of the old religion, is the father or lord of nature. In fact, originally the word Pan is a neutral word, so it might have been the hermaphroditic lord of all nature. But when we find him first in his iconography, in the way that he's represented, he's ithyphallic. In other words, he has an erection, and he has lunar horns and reed pipes. About 850 years before the Christian era, the same image, and remember, sculptors take the same images transmitted from father to son. They learn how to make lots of versions of the same image, and so this image is really perpetuating the same idea or concept through history, even though some names will change and the way it's used will change. So about 850 years before the Christian era, we have now a little transformation of Pan as the Lord of the wilderness. He's a god, just another god, but he lives out in the wilderness because he doesn't live in the cities. The old God, the ancient God, the God of nature and the God of the all is now consigned to the places of the forest and places where there's no civilization. To him is attributed the pipes, the pan pipes. He's still epiphalic and he has the horns, the cloven-hooved, dirty old man look. If people were going to wander off into the woods and it were to get dark, then they would possibly be seized upon by the spirit of Pan and then be sent into what was called a panic. That's where we get the term. Now, about 700 years before the Christian era, we see the same iconography as the beginning iconography of the satyr, the sexual satyr. The phallus becomes a tail. He seems to grow younger. And as we can see, the same thing has been moved to other portions to emphasize. We no longer have an epiphalic kind of Pan, but we still have the horns, and we now have a long tail. And he tends to look like he's getting a little younger, too. He has the cloven hooves. He's carrying something long. It's usually something long. In this particular icon, it's a shepherd's crook. But this has all replaced the phallus, but he's got some kind of long tool that he uses. And very often the horns seem to disappear in a later version of this. Sometimes he appears as a small kind of nature spirit, a horned spirit. And finally, by about 550 in the Christian era, he's grown younger and younger. He's no longer a dirty old man. He becomes a rather young man. He becomes, in fact, the image for the god Eros. And the tail becomes a spear or a bow and an arrow, and he grows into a young athlete. Here is a representation of Eros. Eros is sort of like the Greek Christ. He's the Logos. He's the beginning of all things. It's love that brings things together in creation. So this is the representation that has happened from this icon. In another 150 years, we have the stories of Eros and Psyche, and now the same iconography is used to represent a much younger person, a very youthful lover who's also a poet and a scholar, crowned with the laurel. So here we have Eros. He has wings, no erect phallus, no horns, and as we get far into the Hellenistic period, he grows younger and younger, and he becomes a representation of the Greek Panisi, the Roman Cupid. He's almost got a baby-like kind of iconography, but he has the bow and the arrow, and what he does is he joins unlikely couples together by lust. So here's Cupid. He's getting younger and younger, still has the wings, and his implement is now the bow and arrow. Here we have two forms of Pan. We have the old ancient Pan who's now become a satyr, and we have the very young Panisi, who is sort of the offspring of this, has become a kind of a Cupid. Now, as we approach the beginning of the Christian era, this begins to change very radically. And as we go into the Christian era, this iconography is now used to represent demons, Christian demons, armed with bows and arrows and spears for tempting and torturing. And these demons are exorcised. They're sometimes exorcised out of people's mouths. And they are incubi and succubi who come to people in their sleep and cause them to have evil nocturnal emissions. By about the year 900, in the modern era, The same iconography is representing the Christian devil. Very often he has a face on his phallus or on his rump. He has a tail and some kind of long tool, very often a pitchfork-like type tool, which means a tool of torture. And he has cloven or animal. And at this point, however, he's not wholly evil. He's related very much to the green man. So here we have the Christian Satan, which is still considered to be an angelic being, but he's not necessarily out trapping souls. He's just a very powerful form of nature. And out of that will come other kinds of images that would become important in occultism. But by the year 1200, he is definitely the Christian Satan, the leader of the fallen angels. He's gigantic, beastly. He's a commander of hosts of beings. He enslaves human souls, and he's the enemy of God. Here's one representation of this beastly thing, Lucifer, originally meaning the light bearer. So what does this mean? Well, it was said at the beginning of the Christian era that great Pan is dead, long live Pan. It was a representation and understanding of the fact that the old religions, the old spirituality that had meant things to people thousands of years ago was no longer important. The old gods were passing away. Paganism was not applicable to early medieval humanity. And during this process, erotism and paganism itself and the feminine were basically demonized, looked at as things to be feared and things to tempt people and to be. And we had the rise of male asceticism in the priesthood and the undoing of any apostolic connections that, for example, the Master Jesus might have had with women, with the Magdalenic tradition or any others, were completely forgotten and swept away in this new rise of the human spirit that was associated with beginning of Christianity. And the kind of moral equivalent of this is, in terms of the human psyche and its feelings, is a kind of, if it feels good, it must be bad. If it feels bad, it must be good. There was a concept that in order to be good and to be holy, to be sanctified, one had to do things that were self-abnegating and negative. And God was seen as male, and the deity as a patriarchal kind of king who would be served just like a Hellenistic king or a medieval king, but with no queen. And prayer was understood as ritualized begging of favors from an all-powerful, omnipotent deity who may or may not grant these things. Christ was very often the intermediator between this all-powerful deity. It was all male. Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit, originally at the time of Jesus, was a feminine concept, became a neutral concept in Greek, and then in Latin became a male concept. So finally the whole Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, are all male. So we have a kind of dualism in the West that dominates under this Piscean age. The state religion, in the first place, dominates other forms of religion. The mysteries, there's an obsession with heresy and orthodoxy. The mysteries are driven underground. The great Greek philosophers and those who carried on the traditions of Pythagoras and Trismegistus and Hellenistic mysteries were finally forced up the Nile River to a small town called Akhmim, where they were able to survive for many centuries until the Muslim invasions came and took a lot of their literature and learned from them. And it became the correct thing to do to persecute pagan and native shamanic and other religious traditions, even the original Celtic Christian traditions in Europe were persecuted by the Roman form of morality, and theology supplanted any kind of initiatic mysticism. The only mysticism that was done in monastic groups, privately by individuals. If you want to know how how the ancient mysteries were carried forward into the future through the underground channels and streams that they did follow. You can take my seminar called The Western Mystery Tradition, Medieval and Modern, and there we will see the different ways that the ancient mysteries were brought forward secretly into the future.